I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry. Should we have a catchphrase?
Yeah, sure. Do you have one in mind?
No. I feel like a good podcast should have a catchphrase.
Yeah. I feel like I'm not like catchphrase.
That's good philosophy. And I don't know. That's the worst.
On the first one, wow, we got it on the first try.
Swinging a hit.
Okay. So, today on the podcast, we are discussing the topic of mysticism, a big field and one that's been in conflict and sometimes in conjunction with philosophy for a long time. We brought this on as a topic in Philosophy Club the other day, and we mostly revolved around William James and his paper on mysticism. We talked about mystical experiences more than we did mysticism as a field of knowledge itself. We asked questions around what the value of mystical experiences are and maybe some conditions for what constitutes it. I think James lays out a few conditions that I find really helpful. So he has 4 criteria for what a mystical experience is. Number 1 is ineffability. So you can't communicate it with other people. There's just something, non-communicable. The second criteria is a noetic quality. So it brings you a certain type of knowledge. I'm sure that's something we can get more into later. I think that's pretty meaty. The third criteria is transiency, so it doesn't last for a long time. It's kind of like a flow state, it just isn't permanent. And then the fourth criteria is passivity. So you can't will it into existence. You can put yourself into certain states or, give the groundwork for it, but you can't say, I'm having a mystical experience. Here we go. So I thought we could kind of start the discussion around there and see where we want to go with it.
So I think that's a pretty good start. In the discussion that you had in the Philosophy Club, did anyone sort of come to loggerheads, or did the conversation stall at any point on any particular topic or bone of contention that came up?
Maybe it's relationship with religion and whether or not mystical experiences have to be religious, and how we want to define religion and its role with mysticism. I think we spent a bit of time on. I guess there was a part in James where, in talking about mystical experiences, he does suggest going in with caution when people are talking about them as to their claims. You don't want to give them too much credence. But he had one part where he said you must weigh the evidence or something along those lines, which seems contradictory for something that is totally... There's no evidence to be had definitionally.
Right. If it's ineffable, there's no justification for the knowledge claim.
Yeah.
Right. So then you might say, well, what evidence could there be to offer in that case? And I suppose that it rests on either your trust in there being such a thing as a mystical experience, which, as we understand it as sort of being a relatively rare state of being, or that your co-discussant has also had something they would describe as a mystical experience. So I trust that you've experienced pain because I've experienced pain as well. And even though I can't tell if my pain is your pain or whatever, I still, there's something about our makeup and our range of experiences as humans that makes it very credible that you're having pain experiences very much like the pain experiences that I have when you have pain experiences. Mystical experiences, being not as common as pain experiences, being exceptionally rare, in fact, raises the question of, well, if this is part and parcel of the typical human experience, why don't we all have this, right? Once or twice in our lives. Why isn't this something that, like, if we're capable, if this is a capacity that human beings have to receive mystical experiences or, experience, why don't we have this as a sort of universal, albeit rare, state of consciousness? And so this puts a sort of burden on the mystical experient, the person having the experience, to back it up somehow. But then this creates the kind of problem that you're commenting on, which is, what would they do? What could they do to demonstrate that they've had this experience? And this is where language gets involved. Because if it's really ineffable, and I have to demonstrate to you the quality of the mystical experience that I've had, I'm in a bit of a bind, aren't I? I'm in a pickle. And how do I express the ineffable?
Yeah, actually, to prepare for this a little bit, I read a wonderful paper, The Mystic and the Ineffable by Christopher C. York.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, great piece of philosophy here. Kind of along these lines, one quote that I quite liked, it goes, I'll try to do it justice with my best, Christopher Lee or no. Even if we cannot, by definition, say what cannot be said, no doubt some theoretical benefit will accrue to our efforts towards delineating what exactly it is that is purportedly ineffable and why it is that it cannot be said.
Right. So I think at that phase in my philosophical development, that's from my master's thesis, I was epistemically optimistic. So I looked at mystical experience as a kind of, let's say, phenomenological state that we could get closer to capturing in language if only we cared to put the effort and charitability required to make progress towards this end. So I assume that the first person that drank whiskey didn't have in mind hint of almond, or syrupy texture. None of that occurred to them, right? They developed the language of connoisseurs for whiskey and for wine and for coffee, whatever else you're into. There's a specialist language that applies to our phenomenological states, and we get better at describing the world as we feel it and experience it, the more effort we put into describing these subjective states. And maybe it is just the power of suggestion, but if you tell me there's a vanilla note, in a particular brand of coffee, it's more likely that I'm going to experience that than if you'd never introduced the idea that there is a sort of vanilla note present. And so by analogy, I thought that if we could only get all of the professed experience of mystical experience together in a room, we could develop a kind of language of connoisseurship of mystical experience. And even though you couldn't prove that any of them weren't charlatans, weren't just pretending to have mystical experiences. Assuming that a sort of good enough number of them were honestly professing their subjective states to each other, we might be able to make some real progress into the phenomenological qualities of the mystical experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing that I have heard from people who've had mystical experiences is that it's sort of, again, referencing your work and sort of Plato's cave, it's a lifting of the veil. So you see reality as it is, uninhibited. But that is a dubious claim, and it is interesting to think, because much of the time, mystical experiences are brought about by people who are doing a certain practice, and all those practices have different customs.
Is this code for drugs?
I'll just say experienced meditators. But whether it is
psychonauts.
Psychonauts. But I guess when I think of people who have mystical experience, it is either someone who's taking psychedelic drugs or an experienced meditator. And either one of those has certain parameters that they're going into that I think would color the experience or how it's interpreted. So as far as like a view from nowhere, I'm not sure about that. And again, when it's so subjective, it's very hard to make any grounded claims.
Well, I think that what you're bringing up, right? The connoisseur of psychedelic drugs or the meditation practitioner, they're taking a more active stance, right, as regards their mystical experience. It goes against one of James's criteria that you laid out, right, of absolute passivity. So the mystical experience is a chance or a gift or however you want to describe it. If you set out to have a mystical experience and that is your goal, do you think it's reasonable to assume that you can make it more likely, if not certain, that you have that? Or is there just a mystical part of the brain? It's just a science we don't understand yet, right? There's a sort of mystical experience part of the brain. It's very rarely stimulated by ordinary experience, but you take a certain drug or engage in a certain kind of meditational practice, and with habit backing up our efforts, we can maybe more reliably trigger that sensation, or that part of the brain will open up to us. Mm-hmm. So you think that maybe James is wrong here? Maybe passivity isn't one of the necessary conditions for mystical experience. We can be a bit more proactive in our quest for enlightenment or whatever.
Well, I think maybe with James, when he's talking about the passivity part, he does say that we can lay the groundwork. I forget the phrase he uses exactly, but we can kind of have the conditions to bring this mystical experience along. So if I understand him that way, through my years of meditative practice, I would kind of, I believe that I've had maybe a mystical experience. Again, no one can verify that but me, but at least the way he describes it, I have had something along those lines.
Well, then maybe just to sort of give a real world connection to a philosophical problem, which always, nourishes the subject at hand, would you mind sharing your mystical experience live on air?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I've experimented with psilocybin in the past a couple of times. I've never, a common thing people talk about is an ego death, where they have a total loss of self. I've never quite experienced that, but when I have taken them, I do feel like I'm observing myself, or I'm separate from myself. I'm no longer me in the same way. I'm able to look at myself as I would anything outside of myself, I think. And yeah, there's for me, what always kind of comes about is this idea that I'm just one iteration of what it means to be alive or being or a piece of the universe. It's kind of a shrinking of my ego, I guess. So I think there is something, again, totally subjective, but I would define that, at least how I relate to it, as a mystical experience.
Yeah, I think that there's a sort of cosmic awareness, I suppose, that's discussed in some bits of literature. That it sounds kind of like what you're describing, but I guess that plays differently for each person. So let me ask you a question then: does this mystical experience redound into any sort of practical payoff for your life?
Yeah, this is partly why I wanted to bring up maybe a differentiation between mystical experiences and mysticism as a practice or as a body of knowledge. I don't know if those two things are separate, but I kind of feel maybe they have different things to say. For me, the mystical experience has pretty profoundly informed how I think about ethics and metaphysics. And for me, the sort of use value in this is that it gives me a philosophical perspective during the time, but because it is ineffable, it makes it so that afterwards, when I read something like Derek Parfit and the sort of bundle self, I'm able to take that experience, and then when I see, because the mystical experience isn't an argument, but when I read a philosophical argument, it can kind of help me find the language or the sort of reality behind the sort of thing that I felt and felt to be true, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's a sort of, I guess, trope in the literature of mysticism that the mystic experience returns from their experience changed somehow. Just the way that they hold themselves or the way they look at the world is notably different from people who haven't shared in this kind of experience. The issue here, I suppose, is that none of that je ne sais quoi about the mystic, let's say, translates into demonstrability. Right. And so if we're going to justify a mystical knowledge claim, I need to demonstrate how your experience made you different or better or whatever. Right. But again, well, I've got this perspective. How does that change, right? How you might say, for example, I've become more compassionate as a result. And that might be some sort of demonstrable effect of the mystical experience. I mean, again, we're turning something that's ineffable into a sort of project for a psychology student, right? Like, study professors of mystical experience and see if they behave more compassionately in, situations 1, 2, and 3. This, again, some people might think, well, this is against the very nature of the subject, right? If it's ineffable, it's ineffable. Don't try to make it demonstrable. Don't try to cash it out in terms of, behaviorist, observable features of a person's life. But, it would go a long way towards building up this as a subject for research if more time and effort were spent, toward this. Now, I don't know if this is on the top of anyone's research agenda, right? Usually you follow where the money goes. And I suppose that, there's lots of work to be done in pharmaceuticals before we turn to the problems of mystical experience, which only maybe 1/1000th or less of the population claim to have experience of. I mean, there are always, let's say, liminal experiences. It's hard to tell if most people who have those would describe those as mystical experiences. Do you know what I mean by liminal experience?
No, could you?
So there's the limits of our day-to-day experience, right? And most people prefer to keep their experiences within that comfortable range. They don't like to be threatened or challenged or pushed beyond those ranges. But every once in a while, situations conspire to push us beyond our usual boundaries, and we find out something new about ourselves or the world, and we call that a liminal experience, right? Where you're sort of like, you're stretched beyond what you would normally feel or think, and this can be, intriguing, exhausting, terrifying, any number of sort of things can come up in a liminal experience, right? Like, let's say you fall off a third-story building, and you survive, but you have like, oh my God, in that moment, I felt this, and this. Time slowed down, right? My life flashed before my eyes. I'm transformed in this way. It's not exactly a mystical experience, but it's certainly a liminal experience. It's not one that you have very often, and it's one that it does change the way you look at things.
Yeah.
It has to.
Yeah, okay. Maybe that closer describes what I've experienced then. That seems to fit well with my experience. We read José Ortega in Existentialism, and he talked about the dangers of what mystic sort of authority can do, and the fact that it isn't verifiable, even if it's just someone says, I have this mystical knowledge, because I'm higher than you in some sort of way, you should listen to what I say. And there's all sorts of examples of how power's been abused there. But even just something like, see for yourself, follow this regime. You could spend years of your life down a fruitless path, and oh no, you're almost there, but you just have to see for yourself. And there is a danger in that.
Yeah, I mean, you could just imagine, you're at a party, and there's this guy in the corner. He's like, hey, everybody, let me tell you about my mystical experience. And everyone sort of gathers around. And he has this sort of rapt attention of the crowd while he lays down his heavy story about the depths of his experience and how he was changed and how he sees the world. Maybe, you're in the other corner, sort of eyeing this guy, and you're like, how do I know? Like, how do I know you're not just having us all on right now? How do I know you're not just monopolizing the attention of everybody here because you want to have that attention and not because you are the possessor of any sort of special experience at all? And so you take that sort of party situation and you write it large onto the political stage. Now, we're talking here about things like great leaders or, problematic, dictator types who say, I've got a vision, right? I've got a vision, and I have seen the future. I know what we have to do, right? Just trust me, and I'm going to lead us to greatness in this way or that way. This is a problem, right? This is sort of what we've described as mystagoguery in my dissertation. So it's a problematic basis for making a knowledge claim, an ungrounded knowledge claim, an undemonstrable knowledge claim, and then sort of winning the trust of those around you into following you and sort of exerting social or political power over those people on the basis of that knowledge claim, which can't be supported. So clearly this is deeply problematic, right? We trust the people that we trust because they have some sort of either credential or a track record in doing or, say, a procedure or, let's say, for example, someone's led 30 successful expeditions into the rainforest, right? And we say, well, you've done 30 expeditions, and I trust you to lead my expedition into the rainforest because of the basis of what you've done. Maybe not on the basis of your credentials, but Certainly, when we're having an operation done, we want to see some credentials as well as a track record of success, right? In most situations where we have to trust other people, it's a desideratum, right? We'd rather people have a demonstrated knowledge of or experience with the thing that we're trusting them for. And the mystic can't, by definition, give us any demonstration of their knowledge. So to have that kind of person, to have that kind of, let's say, unsupported belief structure motivate any sort of powerful social or political group is a recipe for abuse. And you see this in, I guess, cults, right? Cults, this is sort of a gross generalization. There might be some really good cults out there that I'm not aware of, but usually there's a charismatic leader. Usually he's got a line or she's got a line that they're reeling out, and people are eating it up without much in the way of critical thought taking place, right? There's not many skeptics in the cult, and if there are, they don't last very long, right? They're weeded out. And so giving credence to these beliefs becomes a sort of reflex rather than, let's say, something that we rationally reflect upon. Like every time the guru speaks, it's not an invitation for rational critique and reflection. It's like an opportunity for appreciation, right? And so like, we have to listen to the great guru or the great leader and hear the next thing they say. And then just like, we soak it in and we come out with, what we need to do next, maybe. That's to say, like, all of this, there can be good leaders. There can be good gurus. There can be good things that happen in this kind of context. But there's also the potential for radical evil, which is worrying.
Yeah, definitely. It's asking you to suspend your skepticism or disbelief, which I think generally is a dangerous thing.
For philosophers especially.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if someone, the alarms go off when someone says, just suspend your critical capacity for the next, half hour. All that being said, right? Rational reflection does not capture the entirety of the world as we experience it, right? There is some sort of, let's say, background to our lived experiences, which we rarely formulate in language or cogitate upon. Even it's a bit like the water that the fish float in, right? And there's a lot of meaningful, textural elements of human existence which exist in this way. They don't. It's hard, and maybe it's not even desirable to bring them into language. I'm going to go back to Wittgenstein here, right? He said that the world can be separated. The world is all the articulatable facts that we have, and the mystical, or das Mystische, is that which cannot be captured in those articulated facts. And moreover, Wittgenstein says that what we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence, right? So this is sort of cordoning off an area of personal experience and saying, look, we can't talk about this, so we shouldn't talk about this, which seems to me to be epistemically pessimistic. And what I'm going to ask you is, do you think this epistemic pessimism is justified, or do you think that it's intellectually lazy of Wittgenstein to do this? Just to put up a fence and a sign that says, keep quiet. Over here is das Mystische.
Yeah, no, I think it is somewhat pessimistic. I think talking about it with authority is probably what we want to avoid when it is something ineffable and subjective. But I think, like you kind of said earlier, like finding the language around it is I think, important and can help people relate to each other, and contextualize, certain experiences they've had. Like, I think of myself, like, sometimes something happens in your life, it's troubling or whatever it is, and you don't know how to feel about it, but then talking through it with someone, you eventually learn how to use language to contextualize it, and it makes it less scary and more understandable, and you get more self-knowledge from it. And I think that's valuable, even if it's something that we maybe can never do with the ineffable by definition. But I think, like with your quote earlier, if we can kind of toe the edges and try our best to describe exactly what this is, that's a pursuit that's worth going after.
The reference slips my mind, but I read a piece about this a story about a young boy being led around by his father, and he is just learning words for things, right? And they go through their walk through the woods, and he points at this bird and that bird, and the boy learns the word for this tree and that bird. And in the passage that I'm referring to, which sadly I can't recall off the top of my head, the author was saying that in this way, the boy's, let's say, contact with the world in itself is eroded, right? So you learn labels, and maybe that's some comfort to you, but you also thereby distance yourself between you, the experiential, phenomenological you, and the world by the application of these labels. And so in a way, philosophers are the worst situated to really immerse and engage with the mystical experience, because we're, by profession, oriented towards putting labels on things and making them rationally parsable. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I do think that that's a worry. And yeah, it's something that I tend to think about a lot. Like, there's always, I guess going back to meditation, they're always saying, like, you're constantly making judgments about your experience. But I think it can be useful to maybe set time aside and put intentionally trying to not put labels on things, and interact with the world without trying to frame everything. But I think at the same time, like, we are brought up to do this, and I think we live in a world where that's kind of necessary to do. I think, it's important to take the steps back, but for me, in order to be a better person and have better self-knowledge and cooperation with other people, investigating the world and being able to articulate your feelings about it and your opinions is something that's worth pursuing. It shouldn't be the end all and be all, though.
Yeah, it seems like any sort of ethical or scientific progress would be nearly impossible if we didn't have words to describe the components of those areas of study. So yeah, I agree that we want to have language. It's been a very, I'm not gonna undersell it. It's been an incredibly useful tool for the betterment of the human species. But still, we have to acknowledge, right? There is some sort of, let's say, pre-linguistic or non-linguistic part of ourselves which is just very closely contiguous with the rest of the world. Like, I remember the moment when I became conscious.
Really?
As an ego.
Really?
I was a baby, and I was being wheeled beneath some trees. It's the first memory I have. And I was looking at the sun sort of like shining through the leaves, and I was really intrigued by the pattern of the sun peeking through the leaves and the sort of like the beauty of it all. And all of that just kind of came to me. And I wasn't at that moment, the first moment of my cognition that I can recall, I didn't feel like I was necessarily separate from any of it. I was only separate from it in the sense that I was having an experience. So I was an experiencing subject. I wasn't the leaves. I wasn't the sun. I wasn't like cosmically engaged with all of that or whatever you want to describe it as, but it wasn't a mystical experience. But I remember that not having labels for any of that, right? I'm applying the labels post-experience. Not having labels for any of that, the world was just so wonderfully rich and ripe. And it was free of all the burdensome thought patterns that I've picked up since then. And you might say, well, it's probably proof that you're a functional adult, that you don't just get wheeled around beneath trees and enjoy the sun, peeking out from between them. But still, there is a certain richness of experience which I am denied for all of my sophistication. There's a cost. And I think that, what makes this topic interesting is that there's a part of us that yearns for that, right? There's a part that yearns for cosmic oneness, or yearns for untroubled cognition. While at the same time, we're not willing to sacrifice any of our sophistication, our language, our intellectual depth. We value all those things dearly. So how do we square this circle? Right.
Yeah, I think it's a interesting question because I think it was John Stuart Mill who said it's better to be Socrates unhappy than a pig who's content. And I've always found that to be somewhat dubious and anthropocentric. At the same time, yeah, it's...
Why not both? I mean, there are higher and lower pleasures. I mean, what he's doing there is he's arguing that the higher pleasures are just better than the lower pleasure. You can be a pig satisfied, absolutely. Just have a great meal and sit there and then unhitch your belt and let your belly kind of just enjoy that feeling of being full. I guess you can kind of more or less surmise what the gorged pig must feel. But I think what he's saying is that you wouldn't sacrifice all of these higher pleasures that you get for that lower pleasure.
Yeah, but I guess in the context of like your memory as being a kid, I think pigs don't worry about climate change. They
don't cause it either, I guess.
Yeah.
At least intentionally.
Yeah, exactly. They probably don't worry about what they did 5 years ago, and I think that is something that, like you said, it can separate you from the world, and this is where I think taking on practices that approach the mystical or trying to get closer to those experiences can be helpful, because then you can come back out and remember what it was like to be a kid a little bit before you interpreted the world through language and sophistication and your memories and all your experiences. I think there's something valuable in that, but we can't just stay as children.
I suppose that the worry here is that if we're trapped in the world of language, right, we're playing a sort of coded game that has a sort of more and more atrophied connection to reality. This sort of tends into a worry that Hannah Arendt had about hyper codification. So the idea here is that if we get interested in language to the point where we're talking about extremely technical subjects, and we're employing mathematics, and we're couching everything we say in a manner that can't really be parsed in terms that ordinary people can understand or that relates to their experience, then we've lost this sort of the plot. We aren't necessarily we've lost the ability to both connect with reality and to be political entities in a way, right? We are trapped in the world of ideas that are in and of themselves alienating, right? So here, I mean, the use of intentionally obfuscating language of the kind, let's say, professional philosophers, at least some professional philosophers, deal in, we're doing ourselves and others a great disservice, right? We're roping ourselves off from reality.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I guess her idea is that we become so specialized in certain fields of knowledge that we're unable to communicate with other people outside of that.
That's part of it. I mean, part of it is that the contemporary scientist, I mean, they can set themselves up as authorities, and through their highly technical and jargon-laden mode of expression, they can be as inscrutable as the mystic and set themselves up in similarly socio-politically privileged scenarios, but with the claim that they have science behind them. But no one really, because it's not accessible to the layperson, nobody asks for them to lay out their work. And yeah, that sounds fine, but show me the math, right? Very rarely would a layperson ask for that to be broken down for them. And so there's a worry, I suppose, that hypercodification can also lead to political abuse in the same way that mystagoguery can. So it's the same structural problem, but from the opposite epistemological standpoint.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess one way that, just from first hearing this, I might want to try and tackle that is using philosophy more as a way of life, or a living, breathing thing that you enact, rather than just a set of dusty principles and things to remember. Again, kind of going back to Ortega, I've been thinking about the idea lately that humanity just kind of questioning itself and trying to understand itself. I think philosophy is one way to do that, but so is like carpentry or cooking or just relationships with other people. I think there's other ways of knowing that maybe aren't as dependent on sophisticated language, that I think we need to continue to value and not undermine. Again, maybe this is my problem with the higher and lower pleasures idea.
I think that for Ortega, though, what makes philosophy special is that it's a sort of universal concern that every human shares, right? Like, what is the meaning of life is something that we all have to contend with, whereas how do you bevel this edge, right, of the table is not something a non-carpenter would really care about, right? So, but we're all kind of stranded in this world without an explanation necessarily of where we came from, where we're going, what we should be. All of these things are questions which might have no absolute objective answer for everyone, but that the consideration of makes us, let's say, more engaged and fulfilled individuals, and makes us it allows us to participate in an essential characteristic of humanity in a way that, like, something more specialized wouldn't. Like something technical that is only a specialist would care about is not something that we can't all relate to it. So if anything makes philosophy special for Ortega, it's the fact that we are all necessarily, by virtue of what we are, engaged in these big questions. And so there's something fundamentally human about asking for the answers to these essentially unanswerable questions, right? The act of questioning is in itself a good for us.
Okay. Yeah, that clears it up a little bit. So mysticism, I'm wondering if you have, I mean, we've touched this a fair bit, but if it has any use value in something like phenomenology or, I guess, existentialism more broadly, and how can it inform philosophy maybe in a more positive way, if it can, in your opinion?
All right. I think that there are different kinds of literacy that we can build up. One is linguistic. If we are interested in building up our capacity to play games, we have a sort of ludic literacy, right? We can learn to play different kinds of games, get better at those. Why not experiential literacy, right? So if I'm going to relate to other humans, I think that my having a sufficiently diverse range of experiences, it's a pretty important, let's say, quality to have. And I think that there are lots of goods that come from having that broad base of experience. It's not immediately useful in the terms of like, what can I get for this? What's a cash value? It doesn't really fit easily within the confines of capitalism, but I think that when you encounter somebody who has a sufficiently broad and deep well of life experiences, they comport themselves differently and they have more of interest to say than people who sort of lack that or have a very narrow range of experiences. And I don't know how to put this, but you meet people and they sort of have a greatness of spirit, and it sets them apart from people who are afraid of having life experiences for the sake of some sort of ontological purity, which I think is equally dubious, more worrisome than maybe somebody who is seeking out these kinds of liminal experiences or mystical experiences. So I do think that there is some, let's say, value in that, in having compassion and understanding for the experiences of other people, and being willing to at least attempt to relate to their professed experiences. So I think that's deeply valuable, and I think that maybe if there's anything that we can carry away from the subject of mysticism is that we have good reasons to want to understand other people's experiences in almost every way, in almost every field. Why not also mystical experience, right? Why not, give them as much credit as a connoisseur, and hear any kind of linguistic proposition they make as a sort of tentative move toward mutual understanding, without giving them an elevated socio-political status that could leave you at risk of abuse. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a sort of golden mean there. Right?
Yeah. So,
be human. Hear people out. Don't let them, use their professed special experience as a cudgel to beat you with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So approach them with compassion, but don't give them your Bitcoin.
I think that's a great takeaway.
Great. All right. Thanks, Chris. This was fun.
Thanks, Dan.
All right.